Hello and welcome to the overview of Chapter 4 as we look at price controls and quotas. The whole idea here of looking at price floors and price ceilings. Glad you could join me. Hope you find this helpful. Always remember to email me if you have questions, if there's anything I can help with. If you have specific questions on the concepts or are trying to work through something, please remember to use that as your lifeline. We are trying to help you in any way that we can. An overview of what we're going to see in this chapter, as I mentioned, price controls. We're looking at quantity controls as well. We'll look at how the government intervenes and the market strikes back. The idea of these governmental controls and interventions that are in place and what impact that has in the markets, what inefficiencies it creates, what side effects are a result of what we see there, and what happens as a result of those interventions. So we're going to take a look at all that good stuff. Stay tuned. Let's start by looking at what a price control is. Well, first of all, it's a government intervention to regulate a price, essentially imposing a price. And there are some cases in which the government is setting a maximum price or a price ceiling. In other instances, they're also setting a minimum price, and that would be a price floor. The best example of a price ceiling would be rent control. The idea that we're controlling the ceiling at which you can have an apartment, and we're setting the maximum amount that someone can charge you for that based on contracts and based on what you initially paid, that kind of thing. And then the price floor is the best example is the minimum wage. And again, we're going to take a closer look at some of these. But the idea of a price floor is that's the minimum someone can pay you. And that would be a minimum wage that we would see there. And we know even across the country that varies from state to state, from county to county. The overarching national average is $7.25. Maryland actually has a $10.10 minimum wage, and then Montgomery County is on an indexed right now at, I believe, $13.25, on its way to $15 an hour over the next couple of years. So this price floor is that minimum at which someone can buy your labor, buy your human resources, your factors of production, and pay you for those goods or services. So let's start by looking at a price ceiling. Now, this was often imposed in times of crisis. Think the Depression, think a natural disaster, war. That type of thing is where we initially saw it. And then what we have seen is more in expansionary periods, because we've had more of those in the last 70 years than we've had the other. So when we have an expansionary period and people continue to do well and prices continue to rise, that inevitably leaves people out of participating because they can't afford to continue participating in an economy, in a market in which they're continually priced out. If you have a minimum wage job, it's hard to be able to make ends meet on a New York City in a New York City apartment when you're making minimum wage. That'd be really hard to make ends meet and try and make a budget based on that. So rent control is a really important aspect here. So if we look at the absence of government control. So this is essentially a free market, and we're a mixed market economy. So we have a free market except for instances in which government tries to regulate health and safety and welfare of the environment. And we see here that at $1,000 monthly rent fee per apartment, we have 2 million apartments that are demanded, and we have 2 million apartments that are supplied. This is efficient because we have equilibrium. At that particular price, we have the same number of buyers and sellers in this marketplace. And so there is no loss, there is no inefficiency, there is no surplus, there's no shortage. We are at equilibrium in this particular instance. But that doesn't mean that everybody gets an apartment. As you can imagine, the 2.4 million people that would love an apartment at $600 a month, well, there's 400,000 people there that aren't getting the apartment at $1,000 a month. Maybe they can't afford it. And so this is where equitable circumstances lead government to intervene and to regulate to try and provide an equitable circumstance where it is needed. The idea of equity is who needs help in terms of getting it, and then how can government help in making that that happen. So a price ceiling being imposed that is binding or effective would need to be below equilibrium. A price ceiling below equilibrium, a price floor above equilibrium. So kind of counterintuitive to what we would normally see here. So the price ceiling needs to be below equilibrium in order to be effective. If the equilibrium is at $1,000 and your price ceiling is at $1,200, well, the market is going to take over there because people are going to buy the apartment at $1,000, and that's pretty straightforward. Now, in this situation with the price ceiling imposed at 800, you're going to see that this is effective, and more people are going to demand that apartment at 800. You can see 2.2 million people want the apartment. But notice law of supply says as the price drops, the quantity supplied actually decreases. And we definitely see that here from E to A. We see the idea of moving from 2 million apartments being supplied to now 1.8 million. But we had 2.2 million people that actually wanted the apartment at this $800 price. So now we have a shortage. Now we have 400,000 apartments that are demanded but not available because apartments were taken off the market. More people want the apartment at that particular price. So at equilibrium, we had 2 million apartments rented at the $1,000 price. Here we only have 1.8 million rented at the $800 price, and we have a gap. We have a shortage. So there's 400,000 people or families that aren't going to get that apartment at that particular price. And that creates inefficiency. Now, we'll talk about these in more detail in a moment, but these inefficiencies can include things like a low quantity, inefficient allocation to different consumers in terms of who's getting it and particularly who's not. A waste of resources can be an inefficiency. Also, a low quality product, and this gives rise to shadow or black markets in the marketplace that are done behind closed doors or under the table, and no one knows actually what's happening in that particular situation. Or what is being priced and sold as a result of it. So this has an impact as well. A price ceiling is going to cause an inefficiently low quantity because, again, the idea is in order to be binding, it's got to be beneath the equilibrium. And in this case, it is. So where we have a gap, a shortage of 400,000 apartments in this particular model, we have inefficiently low quantity, is what this graph is basically saying here. So we could be supplying 2 million of them at $1,000 price in the free market, but in this case we have inefficiently low quantity because suppliers don't want to sell at $800 per apartment for that monthly rent. And that gives rise to key graph 15, this idea of perfect competition with a price ceiling. Now notice again, in order to be effective or binding, in order for it to take effect, the price ceiling, has to be below the equilibrium. Now a price floor would have to be above to have any type of effectiveness, but a price ceiling would need to be below equilibrium in order to do that. So here we have a PC, a price ceiling that is imposed, creating a shortage. The quantity that's actually being supplied is here at QC, and this is essentially the price that it's being sold for. So there is definitely a shortage in this market, an inefficiently low quantity, as we talked about, that is giving rise to this price ceiling that, again, is providing equitable circumstances for those 800,000 people, or sorry, the 1.8 million people that got an apartment. But for the 400,000 that are shut out of that opportunity, if you're one of those, you're looking at it going, well, it wasn't very equitable for me. And that's the inefficiency that's created in the marketplace. So this is the inefficient allocation to consumers. It's great if you were one of the 1.8 million who received it, but if you're not, then it was inefficiently allocated to other people, not to you. And this leads to, again, a shortage. Now, it doesn't mean that those apartments went away. The apartments are still there. But the problem here is that you have an apartment in which it's not now being rented out. So it's a wasted resource. It's sitting there because the supplier doesn't want to rent at $800 a month. They want to wait until it's $1,000 a month and to have that impact. So we have an inefficiently low quality product as well. If we have to lower the price, the apartments that do go, maybe they don't get new paint. Maybe they don't get new carpet. Maybe they don't get new appliances. These create inefficiently lower quality products as a result of what's happening here. So you don't get the $1,000 a month apartment you thought you were getting. The landlords are going to find ways to cut corners. And one of those cutting corners is the black market. So they may be selling the product, one of those 400,000 apartments that didn't go, may be going at a higher price under the table, off of the market, and being sold illegally, or being rented out illegally, in terms of how that plays out. So that gives rise to a shadow market, or a black market in this case, in buying and selling products illegally. And that is obviously causing inefficiency in the market as well. So that leads us to this idea of rent control. Price ceilings are going to hurt residents, and especially those that can't afford the prices that are out there. And so while if you're a lucky one to get one of the apartments, that's great, but it's almost like a lottery. And those that get shut out don't get the same opportunities as those that actually won the lottery, so to speak. So when this is in effect for a long time, the idea is that the buyer may not have a realistic idea of what would happen without them. And so they're looking at this in a very different light. As a result of this. And some, as you saw, some apartments may even go off the market entirely. They may go condo. They may be sold for commercial real estate or something else. The building may turn into a hotel or something where they can make more money. But the idea is there's definite inefficiency in this marketplace. Now, if we look to price floors, this is the idea of a minimum wage and price control on the other end, where there is a minimum that can be paid. Sometimes governments have to push market prices up, and in this case, the minimum wage is that floor of the wage. And as I mentioned, the national government sets this minimum wage at $7.25 an hour. Can you imagine in the DMV trying to make it on a minimum wage job of $7 an hour? That'd be very hard here because the cost of living is so expensive. But if you look at a place like Waxahachie, Texas, or even, probably Birmingham, Alabama, or somewhere, Flagstaff, Arizona, perhaps, where it is cheaper to live, you might be able to do that. And that's why the minimum wage here in Maryland is $10.10 an hour. But in Montgomery County, it's even higher because, again, the cost of living is higher. Here you have $13.25 an hour, on its way up to $15 an hour, because the idea that local governments have made is that we need this to take effect. We need this minimum wage in order to help people make ends meet. And that really is the intended effect. So the example that the text uses here is butter. In the absence of government controls, we can see butter is sold at $1 a pound, and we have 10 million pounds that are demanded and 10 million pounds that are supplied at this particular price point in a free market. But with a price control, with a price floor, remember the floor needs to be above equilibrium in order to be effective. The ceiling would be below. And in this case, we're going to have a surplus because at this higher price, $1.20 rather than $1, we're going to see more suppliers. Law of supply says if the price goes up, supply is going to increase. The quantity supplied is going to increase because people want to make more money. But nobody's out there to buy it at $1.20 like they were at equilibrium. So you actually have 1 million less pounds of butter that are being sold, that are being demanded. And then you're going to have a surplus. Does anyone have enough freezers to store 3 million pounds of extra butter? I don't know. I know I don't. And this is a product that is going to go bad. So this is where the government stepping in, many times they end up buying these types of products, giving them to welfare recipients and senior citizens and that kind of thing in order to try and make ends meet. But again, this creates inefficiency. We have a surplus of product that could be sold in the open marketplace. So we have inefficiently low quantity. We have inefficient allocation of resources. We have wasted resources because there's a surplus sitting out there. We have a product that could be higher in quality than what is necessary in terms of selling this. And then we're going to have shadow markets created as a result of making this happen. So these inefficiencies create a shadow market, and these inefficiencies create a quantity that is lower, and as a result creates a surplus of resources that could be produced and sold on the open market. If it were a free market at equilibrium at $1 a pound, you'd have 1 million more being sold. But as a result of this, you don't have that quantity of 1 million pounds of butter being sold. And if anything, you have more being produced at this price. So you have even more product that isn't being sold. And this is what gives rise to that inefficiently low quantity in terms of what is demanded. And that leads us to key graph 14, this idea of a price floor. Notice upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve, equilibrium at E, price at P, and quantity at Q. But with a price floor, the PF that we see here is essentially needs to be above equilibrium in order to be effective. The price floor is there above equilibrium. And notice where this price floor intersects demand, that's where the product is going to be sold. This creates the quantity at that price floor. So we're going to have a lot left over at what's being demanded or sold at that particular point. And this is creating an efficiency in the marketplace because the quantity is much smaller than what it would be at Q. Now, inefficient allocation of sales is this idea of we have extra. We also are producing it at $1.20, I think was the butter. And as a result of this $1.20, you also have an inefficiently higher quality product. Maybe they're wrapping it in a special wrapper because the government has imposed this price floor in which we can sell it for more money. So this is leading to a higher quality product that probably doesn't need to be higher quality of a product. And again, that's inefficiency in the market too. Now we also have some other ways to control not just price, but also quantity, which is what we're going to take a look at here. This idea of a quota, we're imposing, and this is government again, imposing a certain number of resources that can be sold and no more. And the taxicab medallion system in New York City or in DC is a good example of this. They don't have a taxicab medallion in DC, but they have licenses. And that is a quantity control or a quota that's in place. These licenses are sold to owners. They can then lease them out or rent them out or put them on a car and put somebody in them and start taking cab fares. But the idea there is they're limited in supply in order to try and control the number of people on the streets, keep cars, taxi cab cars to a minimum, and then also trying to provide a living wage for the people that are actually owning those particular licenses. The idea here is that the demand price is going to be what a consumer would demand at that particular quantity, and the supply price is going to be what the producers were able to supply at that particular quantity. Now, what we see here is in the free market, we see again a $5 cab ride. We have 10 million rides demanded. We have 10 million rides supplied, and when a quota is imposed, notice the wedge that is created. So you have 8 million rides that are in this quota. This is leading a smaller supply, but a great in terms of price, but the license holder is actually going to get this particular wedge of product that we see here of the dollar amount. So with the quota imposed, a smaller quantity, are going to have a greater price that's going to be charged because the idea here is the taxi cab owner can charge at point A, even though in a normal world with a quantity like this, they'd be charging at B. So they can charge $6, and this wedge from 6 to 4 is going to go into the taxi cab owner's pocket. But what they're not producing is the 10 million rides that were produced at equilibrium in that free market. So 2 million riders are actually not going to get a ride as a result of this. And this leads to key graph 16, this idea of a quota limit imposed. And this quota limit is creating a wedge or this quota rent box that then is going to go to the owner of the license, the owner of the medallion. Now, the yellow box is actually deadweight loss. The idea here is this is the inefficiency that's created. So we were producing at Q, at quantity Q. Now we're producing at quantity with this quantity control, QC, and we're producing less of it. We have less riders in these taxi cabs. That is creating inefficiency in the market. Even though the taxi cab owners, because they hold the license, are actually making more money. They're charging at P1 instead of at P or even P2. They're earning the money at P1 because they have the license. But if you're not a license holder, you're not benefiting from that. You probably don't even have a cab to run in the city because if you don't have a license, you're not one of the quantity controlled taxi cabs in the city. And that causes inefficiency. That creates the deadweight loss that we see here, the opportunities that have gone by that aren't able to be sold, aren't able to be produced. And that's the inefficiency we see in this marketplace. So to recap then, the wedge that is created, that quota rent that we see there, is this box, that green box that essentially goes to the producer, to the owner of the medallion, the owner of the license, whatever they own in terms of the quantity control. And that wedge is part of their profits. So it's going to be above and beyond what is normally what would be at P. Is going to be a part of their profits. So they're going to get everything all the way up to and including P1 now, instead of what would be at P in a free market type of enterprise. So that's the wedge that we're talking about. This wedge is that green box, this space that becomes part of their profits in addition to what they would have made at price in equilibrium. The quota rent then is that space, and the idea there is that it is an added bonus to the employer and an incentive for them to continue to keep this medallion and buy these medallions or licenses or own these quantity controls because they're going to get additional revenue from it. So it's important to note that there's also a lot of inefficiencies in this market as a result of the quantity controls because, again, there are there's a deadweight loss, but there's also mutually beneficial transactions not taking place because of that inefficiency, because of that deadweight loss space. There are things that aren't being produced, taxi cab rides that aren't being given, different quantities that aren't being produced as a result of this, and other methods and incentives for illegal activities, the black market, the shadow markets, things happening behind the scenes or under the table, are incentives for illegal activities as a result of that. Now, taking a look at that particular key graph one more time, because I want to move to the final graph that we have in this chapter, and that's taking this quota rent box and turning it into government revenue. If the government were to impose a tax, such as an excise tax on goods and services, that quota rent, that wedge, becomes tax revenue instead of profits that go to the producer. That money then is going to go to the government. And this is a tax. Remember, tax is a related government action that can shift the supply curve. That's shifting it leftward or inward, leading to a higher price at which people would pay P1. Well, the box now goes to the government. The arbitrarily smaller quantity that's being produced is as a result of this supply curve shift, also creating a deadweight loss, also creating an inefficiency in this marketplace. So what the producer ends up getting in this scenario, because of the excise tax, is they're only going to receive revenue up to and including P2, not at P, what would have been at equilibrium in a free market, not at P1, what would have been with the quantity control in place, but now P2. So they're suffering in addition to the consumer paying a higher price for this good. The government is benefiting, and the producer gets a chunk taken out of their revenue in addition to what the consumer is actually paying more of. So again, creating more inefficiency and deadweight loss in this space as a result of this excise tax. So that essentially ends the chapter. I do want to take a moment just to kind of, in summary, wrap up these ideas. So price controls definitely create inefficiencies. Why do we have these? Because government is trying to provide some level of equity, some level of giving people what they need where they need it, and trying to correct the gaps between those that can afford rents that are continuing to rise arbitrarily and expand exponentially to those that are making minimum wage and trying to provide for their families in markets where it's a high cost of living. So that's where price controls come in terms of government intervention. It's really imposed for that purpose. Now what we see is the price ceiling is that maximum amount that a consumer can be charged by a business or a producer in order to keep costs down and in order to allow for reasonable expenses and slowing down the rising cost of living as a result of what people are experiencing. But what we know is it does lead to some inefficient allocation of resources, definitely lower quality. It also leads to shadow markets or black markets as a result of some apartments going behind the scenes and shady transactions taking place. Now, the price floor is a minimum wage. This is the idea. Again, a price floor needs to be above equilibrium to be effective. Price ceiling needs to be below equilibrium in order to be effective or binding. But here we also have inefficiencies. We also have the allocation of resources that is inefficient, and there's waste. We also have an inefficiently high quality product on a price floor because we're paying more for that. So the butter example that the textbook gives is created in inefficiently high quality items because they're adding on value added services that aren't necessarily needed in this particular environment. So that's also creating inefficiency. And then the last one is the quantity controls or the quotas that we have in place here. Those quota limits, licenses to taxi cabs, for instance, being an example. And that creates the wedge, the quota rent that then goes to the producers. And again, when that quota rent box becomes an excise tax, that government would go, that money would go to the government. That quota rent would go to the government rather than going to the producer. So again, even quantity controls are inefficient because they are leading to different types of inefficiencies and deadweight loss in terms of what could be produced in a free market environment versus in a quantity controlled environment. You have less being produced. You're producing it and selling it at a higher price. Consumers are paying more. Producers are getting less if the government is charging an excise tax as a result of it. If they're not, producers are getting more, which encourages them to buy the medallions, the licenses, or whatever the quantity control is. But it does encourage illegal activity in terms of selling things under the table, and we see some of that going on as well. I won't go into each of these items, but I would urge you to pause the video here and take a look at the key terms. If you can't quickly put something together with what the key term is in terms of a definition or an example, then I would pause here and say go back to the textbook, take a look at the options that are there, and then come up with a better working answer to work through those. So I hope you found this helpful. Again, applying it to business in terms of price controls, what type of a business did you have in your business, and how might price controls or these types of price ceilings and price floors impact your business today? How would it affect your business? What would a price ceiling look like when it came to your business? How about a price floor in terms of the impact it would have on your business? And then how would those price controls impact your ability to do business? What impact would that have in terms of what you're able to produce, what quantities you're able to produce it at, and what you're able to sell it at? So again, what inefficiencies would be created here? These are things to think about as a business owner that is being regulated by the government, and all businesses are being regulated in some way, shape, or form by that government. And then how might businesses today be responding to this? How might they be reacting when they're faced with these types of things? When you look at a minimum wage, or you look at a price ceiling, or you look at the inefficiencies that are taking place. All of these have an impact on business, which is why we're studying it here in microeconomics. And I hope you'll take a moment to think about that and reflect on it. And we'll talk more about it in class. Here are the answers to the take-home quiz questions. These are the multiple choice. So again, if you have a moment and want to go through the answers and then pause the video here to check your work, you're more than welcome to do that. The answers with explanations from the textbook will also be posted to my MCPS Classroom, and would encourage you to check that out as well. I hope you found this video helpful for Chapter 4 as we looked at price controls, the role of price ceilings and price floors, the role that government plays in intervening in markets, and the effects that it has, the inefficiencies that are created as a result of that. We will see you again in Chapter 5 when we look at elasticity, a great concept to cover and lots of details to go through there. But until then, I hope you found this helpful. Good luck on the upcoming quiz, test, or AP exam, and we will see you in Chapter 5.